All right, let's go. Number 10. The hands that are missing fingers. In the foothills of the French Pyrenees in the Hautes-Pyrénées, a cave called Gargas runs roughly 500 meters into the limestone on two levels. The lower galleries hold the chambers that matter here. On their walls, in red and black, are the outlines of human hands made by pressing a palm flat against the rock and blowing powdered pigment around it until the stone held the shape and the hand did not. There are 231 of these images at Gargas. 114 of them are missing at least one finger segment. The images have never been dated directly. A fragment of bone, wedged into a crack in the wall beside them, returned. A radiocarbon age of roughly 26,800 years, which gives an approximate frame. Hand stencils in the Cosquer Cave on the Mediterranean coast near Marseille have been dated more directly to around 27,000 years ago, and they show the same pattern of shortened fingers. Whoever made these marks did so within a few thousand years of each other at opposite ends of what is now France. The simplest explanation has always been that nothing was missing at all. A person can fold two fingers under the palm, press the remaining ones flat, and produce an outline that looks like a maimed hand. That reading requires no injury, no surgery, and no pain. And for most of the 20th century, it was the mainstream position. What makes this difficult is a set of marks in a different medium. In 1976, the archaeologist Claude Barrière reported impressions of human limbs preserved in hardened mud inside Gargas, thought to be the same age as the stencils. Some of those impressions are also short of digits. A folded finger leaves no trace in clay. In 2018, Bray Macaulay, David Maxwell, and Mark Collard, working at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, approached the problem from the other direction. Instead of arguing about the images, they searched an ethnographic database of world cultures for documented cases of deliberate finger removal. They found 121 societies that practiced it across Africa, Eurasia, Oceania, and the Americas, and sorted the recorded motives into 10 categories among them: sacrifice, mourning group identity medical treatment, marriage, and punishment. The finding proves nothing about Gargas. It removes one objection. Taking part of a finger on purpose is not a strange idea that has to be invented to explain a cave wall. It is something human societies have arrived at independently over and over on every inhabited continent. The counter-arguments remain serious. Frostbite takes fingertips. So do circulatory disorders. Several researchers have pointed out that the Gargas hands are frequently short at the middle and ring fingers. Cultures that amputate deliberately, overwhelmingly, take the little finger because losing the middle finger of a working hand in an ice age costs far more. Others read the patterns as a gesture system rather than a record of injury. The one thing the cave cannot supply is a body. No skeleton from Gargas has been recovered against which any of this could be checked. The walls preserve the shape of a hand held against stone 27,000 years ago. They preserve nothing of what happened to it, or whether anything happened to it at all. Number 9. The woman in grave 105. 6 kilometers northwest of the town of Pazardzhik, in southern Bulgaria, a mound of accumulated settlement debris rises 12 meters above the surrounding fields and measures about 110 meters across. This is Tel Yunatsite, one of the largest artificial mounds in Europe. It was first opened in 1939 by the Bulgarian archaeologist Vasil Mikov and has been excavated on a regular annual basis since 1976. The layers at the base belong to the late Chalcolithic, the copper-using centuries of the 5th millennium BC. These were not villages in any modest sense. The communities of Thrace and the lower Danube were smelting copper on a scale unmatched anywhere else at the time and producing the earliest worked gold known at Varna on the Black Sea coast and here at Yunatsite. Recent survey indicates the settlement extended well beyond the mound with a raised core and a lower district around it. Roughly a third of the tell has now been dug. Near the southeastern edge of the topmost Chalcolithic building horizon, dated to roughly 4200 to 4000 BC, a team led by Yevor Boyadziev of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences and Ioannis Aslanis recovered a burial catalogued as grave 105. The skeleton was a woman. Her right hand was gone. The obvious explanation was waiting in the stratigraphy directly around her. The Chalcolithic settlement at Yunatsite did not fade out. It ended in a violent assault, and the destruction layer sits immediately above the horizon her grave belongs to. A missing hand in a town that was overrun looks at first reading like a casualty of that event. But here's where the bone contradicts the site. The analysis carried out by Steve Zahner and Joachim Wall at the University of Tübingen and published in 2013 established two things. Congenital absence could be ruled out. The limb had developed normally and then been cut short, and the end of the arm carried the changes a living body produces around a wound. She had not lost the hand in the attack. She had lost it years earlier and gone on living in the settlement afterwards. That reorders everything about the case. The removal happened during ordinary life in a functioning Copper Age town, not during its destruction. Zahner and Wall worked through the possibilities. Weapons of the period were copper blades, and axes poorly suited to shearing a hand off cleanly. Congenital causes were excluded. Punishment and accident remained on the table, but the character of the separation and the survival that followed it led them to conclude that a deliberate surgical intervention was the most likely explanation on the available evidence. It is worth being precise about how rare this is. Grave 105 remains the only reported case of surgical amputation from the entire Chalcolithic of Bulgaria out of decades of digging across dozens of sites. That is not because the practice was unknown in the Balkans. It is because a missing hand in a 5,000-year-old grave almost never comes out of the ground with enough recording around it to exclude the dull explanations first. Nothing at Yunatsite records why. There is no text because there was no writing. There is no depiction. There is no instrument that can be identified as the one used. What is left is the shape of the arm and the fact that it kept working. The town that ended in fire is now a mound of packed layers being taken, apart one season at a time. Grave 105 belonged to the last generation to live there. The attack that destroyed her community left its mark in a burnt horizon a few centimeters above her. It did not take her hand. Something else in a quieter year had already done that. Number 8. The toe that was refitted. The object is 3 pieces of carved wood joined to leather, drilled along the edges, and laced with leather thread. It is shaped to the exact contour of a right foot, and it is still attached to the front half of a mummified foot, with the leather still threaded around the side where it was tied on. It was recovered from a rock-cut tomb complex on the hillside of Sheikh Abdelkurna, on the west bank at Thebes opposite modern Luxor. The complex itself was cut in the 15th century BC for the family of Mary, a high priest of Amun, but burials continued to be inserted into it for over 1,000 years. The foot came from a later shaft tomb in the entrance hall dating to the 3rd, intermediate period, which had been thoroughly looted. The remains it belonged to were disarticulated in the fill. They belonged to a woman who died between the ages of 50 and 60, identified as Tabakatenmut, a priest's daughter who lived somewhere between 950 and 710 BC. Beneath the wooden toe, the stump of her amputated big toe is well healed. Whatever removed it did so long before she died. The construction is deliberate throughout. The 3 wooden sections sit against each other with a hinge at the joint, so the piece flexes where a toe flexes. The front edge is beveled and the underside flattened for stability. 8 lacing holes run along the inner edge and 4 along the outer. One suggestion for why the toe was lost points to circulatory disease and the tissue, death that follows it, which leaves a stump that closes over without stitching. Through that remains a proposal rather than a diagnosis. What makes this significant is not the carving. It is what the carving had to survive. A cosmetic object placed on a body at burial does not need to fit. Examination of the piece has shown that it was refitted several times, reshaped to match the foot as the foot changed. That is the signature of a device in use, adjusted over years by someone who kept adjusting it. A second Egyptian artificial toe sits in the British Museum, acquired by the Reverend Greville Chester in 1881. It is made of cartonnage linen, soaked. in glue and coated with tinted plaster, and it once carried a false toenail. It shows heavy wear. Unlike the wooden one, it does not bend. Jackie Finch, working at the University of Manchester, took the question into a gate laboratory. Exact replicas of both toes were fitted to two volunteers who had each lost a right big toe tested with Egyptian-style sandals. The pressure data showed that both designs functioned as replacements and that walking in a sandal without one produced significantly different peak pressures. The toes were not decoration for the afterlife. They did a job. Amputation itself was older in Egypt than either toe. A study of 204 skeletons and more than 2,000 long bones from the Giza necropolis, spanning the Old Kingdom between roughly 2700 and 2190 BC, identified two healed amputations. The burials there divide by rank according to the design and contents of the tombs. One of the two men was a high official missing the lower right leg. The other was a laborer missing the left forearm. Both had survived long enough for the bone to close over. There the cases separate. The official's remaining limb stayed robust, which is what happens when a limb keeps taking load, and the authors raised the possibility of a supporting device. The laborer's cortical bone had thinned, which is what happens when it does not. For a long time, the oldest practical prosthesis on record was neither Egyptian toe. It was a Roman leg of bronze and wood from a grave at Capua, made around 300 BC and kept at the Royal College of Surgeons in London. It was destroyed in an air raid during the Second World War, and only replicas of it remain. The wooden toe from Thebes is older by centuries. It is also still where it was found, laced to the foot it was carved for. Number 7. The footless men on the pots. The Moche held the desert valleys of the north coast of Peru between roughly AD 100 and 800, irrigating them from the rivers that come down off the Andes, and building platform mounds out of millions of molded adobe bricks. They left no writing. Almost everything anyone knows about how they saw their own bodies comes from what they modeled in clay, and they modeled a great deal of it. Portraits, illnesses, deformities, injuries, acts. Among the thousands of surviving stirrup spout vessels are figures with one or both feet missing. A survey of some 800 Moche vessels of medical interest held in the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin found 127 of them. 42 show the figure placing a cup-shaped prosthesis onto the leg stump or taking it off. For decades, the sensible reading of these vessels was symbolic rather than clinical. Footless figures in Moche art frequently carry a second modification: a cut across the nose and lip that produces a skull-like face. They appear in scenes associated with the dead and with drumming and music. One influential analysis divided them into two roles: attendants who served, a ruler among the living, and attendants who served him in the world beyond it. Read that. Wait, footlessness is a symbol, and the potters were not documenting surgery. The problem is that the skeletons agree with the pots. In 2000, John Verano, Laurel Anderson, and Regulo Franco published 3 probable cases of healed foot amputation in Moche, skeletal remains from the north coast. In each, the joint surface where the ankle meets, the foot had been closed off by new bone growth, and the shafts of the tibia and fibula were robust, which happens when a limb is loaded and walked on. One of the individuals, a person of about 1.5 meters in height, had lost both feet and lived on. The vessels also record the method. Many of the modeled stumps carry a groove running across the leg, which indicates that the ankle bumps on either side were left in place. That points to disarticulation at the ankle joint rather than a cut through the shin. It is a technique Western surgery arrived at roughly 1,500 years later, under the name of the Scottish surgeon James Syme. The skeletal material came from excavations in the coastal valleys, including the Huacatao Viejo, the painted adobe platform, at the El Brujo complex in the Chickamauga Valley, where Franco and his colleagues had been uncovering Moche architecture and burials since the early 1990s. The bones and the ceramics were not found together, and neither was used to interpret the other. They arrived at the same anatomy independently. Evidence has continued to accumulate since. In 2013, A Polish and Peruvian team excavating a Wari imperial mausoleum at Castillo de Huarmey found two individuals, a man and a woman, placed in the antechamber outside the main burial chamber. Both had lost the left foot, disarticulated at the ankle, long enough before death for the bone to remodel. Their position has been read as the placement of guardians, though that is an inference from where they lay, rather than something the burial states. Further north at the center of Tukum, two young women, buried in separate temple mounds several centuries apart, had each lost the left foot. One belonged to the period before the Inca arrived, the other to the years of Inca rule. Radiographs of both show the difference in cortical thickness between the two sides of the body, the signature of one limb that carries less than its share and one that compensates. What the two bodies of evidence do not share is a reason. The bones establish that. Feet were removed at the ankle deliberately, and that people walked afterwards on wooden or gourd-like cups. Whether that happened as medicine, as punishment, as an act tied to religious office, or as some combination of all three is not recoverable from a joint surface. In 1913, a Peruvian physician, Velez Lopez, described a Moche skeleton with both feet removed and cup-shaped wooden prostheses padded with wool. He published no photographs. The skeleton has never been located since. What remains of that particular case is a paragraph. Number 6. The penalty that people survived. At Sanmenxia in Henan province, along the Middle Yellow River in eastern, Zhou Cemetery produced two burials that look entirely ordinary. Both men were aristocrats. Both were buried with the goods appropriate to their rank in the manner their society reserved for its upper tier at some point between roughly 2,500 and 2,300 years ago. Each of them is missing a foot, and with it about 8 centimeters of the lower leg. One lost the left, one lost the right. In both cases, the severed ends had healed over completely. The two burials are cataloged as M693, the man who lost the left leg, and M432, the man who lost the right. The analysis published in 2024 by Zhou, Chan Wang and colleagues set them against a body of documentary and artistic evidence that had been known for a very long time without any physical confirmation at all. Ancient Chinese law recognized a graded set of corporal punishments conventionally counted as 5. Tattooing the face, cutting off the nose, cutting off a foot castration, and death. The third of these written Yue is the one that concerns us. The character appears in Shang oracle bone inscriptions, in a form that shows a foot being cut with a saw. Western Zhou bronze vessels carry engravings of one-legged men serving as gatekeepers, which suggests both that the punished were kept in employment and that a particular kind of low office was associated with them. The penalty was in use for more than 1,000 years before it was abolished in the 2nd century BC. What makes this case unusual is the healing. A punitive amputation performed and then abandoned kills the person, and it does not take long. Severing a leg below the knee opens vessels that will empty a body in minutes if nothing is done. Past that, there is shock, and past shock. There is infection in a world with no concept of what infection was. These edges closed, remodeled, and bore weight again. Somebody controlled the bleeding. Somebody dressed and managed the wound through weeks of the most dangerous period. Somebody fed and moved a man who could not walk. The reading the authors reached is that this was not improvised. The state that ordered the foot removed had a procedure for what came afterwards, because a punishment that killed its subjects was not the punishment the law had specified. Two other cases fill in the picture. In 2022, Li Nan and colleagues at Peking University reported a woman aged between 30 and 35 whose right foot had been removed. Her skeleton showed no disease that would have required it, and the cut was rough rather than clinical. The legal code specified the left foot for lesser offenses and the right for graver ones, which places her, if the reading holds, among the seriously convicted. The same year, a separate team described a man from the Chongping Yunatsite in Shanxi, aged between 50 and 70, who had lost the lower third of his left tibia and fibula. The healing was extensive. Their conclusion named the penalty as the most probable cause, while stating plainly that surgery or accident could not be excluded. These are not the only skeletons. A review of the Chinese literature lists 7 further reports of missing limbs from the Shang and Western Zhou periods, published between 1956 and 1999, a foot here, a lower leg. There, one case with both hands and feet gone, one upper limb. Most were recorded briefly and never revisited with modern imaging. The scale of the practice is documented in the written record rather than the bones. Hundreds of separate offenses could carry the penalty from rebellion and theft down to climbing over the wrong gate. In the spring and autumn period, the punishment was common enough that the market for a particular kind of shoe is recorded as having shifted in response. There were enough people walking around without a foot for the footwear trade to notice. The 2 men at Sanmenxia were not driven out. They were buried inside the cemetery of their class with grave goods in tombs that give no sign of disgrace. Whatever the missing foot had meant, on the day it was taken, it did not follow them into the ground. Number 5. The graves that were opened too early. Between 1975 and 1982, a Neolithic cemetery at Vedrovice in Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, was excavated down to 110 graves. The people buried there belonged to the linear pottery culture, named for the incised bands on its ceramics and known in the German literature by the abbreviation. That has become standard everywhere. These were the first farmers of Central Europe. Beginning in the 6th millennium BC, they moved along the Belt of Light, fertile loess soils that runs from the middle Danube northwest toward the Rhine, building timber longhouses 30 meters and more in length, keeping cattle sowing emmer and einkorn. Vedrovice is one of the better studied cemeteries they left, and it has been the subject of isotope work dating programs and osteological reanalysis for decades. Burial 82 held an old man, placed face down with all 4 limbs drawn up and the left forearm folded beneath his chest. The hand was absent. So were the lower ends of the radius and the ulna. Nothing in the grave suggested that they had been disturbed, moved, or destroyed after burial. A reassessment by Krapina in 1996 concluded that this was a healed, intentional amputation following an injury. That is a specific claim, and it rests on the condition of the bone ends, rather than on the arrangement of the body. The paper it appeared in was framed around a larger question, whether surgery began at the origins of agriculture in Central Europe. Burial 82 was offered as one of the few pieces of physical evidence available to answer it. The body position is worth noting on its own. Linear pottery burials are overwhelmingly placed on the side with the knees drawn up. This man was face down. His grave was already unusual before anyone examined his arm. There is a second case in Thuringia in central Germany at a linear pottery cemetery called Sondershausen. Burial 18. One of 45 held a man laid on his back with his legs flexed to the left, his right arm bent across his chest, and that hand resting on his left shoulder. The other forearm and hand were not there. And again, the excavators recorded no disturbance. The shaft of the upper arm bone is close to complete, which is the same pattern seen in cases accepted elsewhere as amputation. What makes this entry different from the rest of the list is where the uncertainty comes from. It does not come from the 6th millennium BC. It comes from the 1950s. Sondershausen was dug when field recording was thinner, and the graphic documentation from that. Excavation is poor. The bone survives. The information that would let anyone decide between trauma. Disease and surgery largely does not. The same limitation runs through the whole subject. Amputation is difficult to identify in old skeletal material at the best of times, because a missing hand in a grave has a long list of mundane explanations before anyone reaches for a knife. Small bones are the first to go. Acidic soil dissolves them. Roots push through them. Burrowing animals move them. A later pit, a plow, a drainage cut, or a badly placed trench takes them off entirely, and the person doing the digging may not notice that anything is gone. To argue that a hand was removed during life, all of that has to be excluded. And the exclusion has to happen at the moment of excavation, while the sediment around the bones is still in place. It cannot be done afterwards from a box. Every case on this list that can be argued in detail was either excavated recently or re-examined with imaging that did not exist when the bones came out of the ground. The pattern in the published literature is not that early farmers rarely lost limbs. It is that the record thins out wherever the digging was done before anyone thought to look for this. Other early Neolithic cases have been reported, and then left unresolved for the same reason, including skeletal material from a collective tomb at Odegsen in Lower Saxony published in the 1980s. Each of them sits in the literature as a possibility rather than a case cited by later authors as a maybe never able to be moved into the column of things that are known. The Vedrevis bones are held in a Czech museum collection. The Sondershausen bones are held in a German one. Both men are still there, each with an arm that ends where it should not. The plans and sections that could have told us how they came to be that way were never made, and no amount of later technology can produce them. Number 4. Buthiers, Boulogne-Court. 70 kilometers south of Paris, in the department of Seine-et-Marne, a sand quarry was scheduled for expansion in 2005. Rescue excavation ahead of the machinery uncovered a Neolithic settlement. 7 longhouses of Danubian type, dated by the pottery in their borrow pits to between 4900 and 4700 BC, plus 2 small clusters of graves and 1 isolated cremation. The people who built them were farmers of the late Danubian tradition, at its western edge in the last generations, before it dissolved into something else. Most of the burials were shallow, cut to fit the body, and nothing more. Burial 4 and 16 was not. Its pit was oblong, 2.5 meters by 1.5, and sunk a full 1.5 meters into limestone subsoil. Cutting that deep meant working through bedrock with antler stone and wood. Radiocarbon placed the burial between 4906 and 4709 BC. Inside lay an elderly man, on his left side, knees drawn up, head to the east, and face turned south. A polished schist axe, 205 millimeters long, made from stone imported from far outside the Paris basin, lay near his skull. Its blade was narrow and elongated, substantially longer than any axe otherwise known from burials of this period in the region. A flint pick, 300 millimeters long and weighing 542 grams, had been placed at right angles across his left upper arm. Use-wear analysis showed it had barely been used. Picks of this kind are usually about a third that length and roughly made. At his feet were the remains of a very young sheep or goat. Complete animals are rare in early Neolithic graves. A legged jaw or a head is the norm. Neither tool has a parallel in the burials of this culture. The left forearm and hand were not in the grave. They were not anywhere in the grave. The soil around the place where they should have been was undisturbed, and the neighboring bones were well preserved, which removed the ordinary explanations. The detail that changes the story is the shape of the cut. The lower end of the upper arm bone had been severed cleanly across the projections at the elbow, at oblique angles in a way that neither trauma alone nor a developmental condition produces. 3-dimensional microtomography carried out at the University of Poitiers showed a new layer of cortical bone laid down over the end. He had survived the operation by months at minimum, more likely by years. There was no sign of infection at the site. Comparison of the 2 upper arm bones showed the left was neither wasted nor calcified, meaning the stump had continued to move and to carry load. Cécile Bouquet-Marquand, the forensic scientist Philippe Charlier, and the excavator Anaïs Samsoun published the case in 2009. Their reconstruction of the procedure turns on an odd choice. The cut sits just above the elbow joint at the thickest and most awkward part of the bone. Anyone setting out to remove a forearm with flint would have cut higher up the shaft, where the work is easier. Their reading is that an injury had already partly severed the arm and that the surgeon took the wound as given and finished it. A fragment of cortical bone left on the back of the humerus suggests the last few millimeters broke away under the weight of the limb, the way a cut branch snaps before the blade is through. The new bone laid over the end is denser than the original. Nothing in the rest of the skeleton records the injury that made the operation necessary, and nothing records what it was for. The man himself had lost every tooth in his jaws during life, with resorption and infection through the gums. He had severe arthritic change in his neck with one vertebra polished smooth, at the joint and further degeneration down the spine and through both legs. He was old, disabled, in constant pain, and buried in the deepest grave on the site with two imported objects that appear nowhere else in the local burial record. Losing an arm in a farming community means losing the ability to do most of the work that keeps a household alive. It did not remove him from the group. Whatever position he held, he seems to have held it afterwards. For 13 years after publication, this was the oldest accepted amputation anywhere in the world. It was also the anchor of a wider model that complex surgery arrived with agriculture, because agriculture concentrated people injuries and knowledge in one place. The axe and the pick are cataloged. The pit has been backfilled, and the quarry has moved on. The forearm has never been found. Number 3, Krapina 180. The object is a piece of a right forearm bone, the upper portion of an ulna, and the interesting part is the end of it. The break is not a break. The bone stops, and where it stops, it is capped rounded over, smoothed, closed by a collar of new growth that could only have formed while its owner was alive. It came out of a rock shelter called Husinjakovo on a sandy hill about 40 kilometers north of Zagreb in Croatia. The deposit was found because the hill was being quarried for sand, and in 1899, the Croatian paleontologist Dragutin Gorjanović Kramberger began excavating it. He worked there until 1905 and recovered fragmentary remains of as many as 80 Neanderthal individuals, together with stone tools and the bones of the animals they ate. It is still the largest sample of Neanderthals from any single locality anywhere. The material is commingled, which is to say, the bones of different people are mixed together in the deposit and cannot generally be reassembled into individuals. Most of what came out is broken. The deposits are dated to roughly 130,000 to 120,000 years ago, during the last warm interval before the final glaciation, when this part of Europe was wooded and mild. Gorjanović Kramberger noticed the ulna and offered an interpretation. He was a careful observer who described the Krapina material in detail and speculated openly about the injuries he found in it. He read this bone as a fracture that had failed to knit, where the two halves healed separately and the break site turned into a false joint. That is a recognized condition, and it produces bone that can look superficially like an amputated stump. Then, the specimen was re-examined. In 2013, Diane Eddy, working on a master's thesis at the University of Kansas, set Krapina 180 against a comparative series of bones from people whose injuries were documented, held in the collections of the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. Some of those individuals had suffered fractures that never united. Some had undergone amputation. The point of the exercise was to find features that reliably separate the two. The features she identified are unglamorous and specific. Cortical bone thickness. The absence of extra, bony growth spilling around the site. A smooth, rounded cap rather than an irregular surface. No opening from the injury into the marrow cavity. And the absence of eburnation. The hard polish that develops where two bone surfaces grind against each other, which is characteristic of a false joint, and which the Krapina ulna does not have. None of those criteria is dramatic on its own. Together, they separate two conditions that look similar to the eye and behave differently under a scan. By those criteria, Krapina 180 is not a non-union. It matches the amputations. In the same year, Virginia Hutton Estabrook and David Freyer reached a compatible view. In their survey of trauma across the Krapina collection, they treated the callus at the end of the shaft as the likely terminus of an amputated ulna, and noted that the bone above it is thick and shows no sign of infection. None of that establishes that another Neanderthal removed the forearm. The team that published the Borneo case in 2022 was careful to note that reports of deliberate amputation among Neanderthals are now regarded as inconclusive, and that these individuals remain evidence of care rather than proof of surgery. A limb can be lost to an animal, to a fall, or to a crushing injury that leaves the rest of the arm intact. It can also separate over weeks through tissue death with nobody touching it at all. There is a further caution that comes from an unexpected direction. Primatologists working with wild chimpanzees and bonobos have recorded high rates of limb loss in some communities, mostly from wire snares and from falls, and those individuals frequently survive. They adjust how they climb and how they feed. They do so without surgery and often without any observable help. Survival after losing a hand is not on its own proof that anyone helped. What the Krapina bone establishes is narrower than that and harder to argue with. Somewhere between 130,000 and 120,000 years ago. In what is now northern Croatia, an arm ended above the wrist. The body it belonged to went on producing bone at the end of it for long enough to seal the stump over. The rest of that individual is somewhere in the Krapina collection, unidentified among the mixed remains of 80 people. There is no skull to put with the arm. There is no way to know how old they were or whether they were male or female or how much longer they lived. There is a single fragment of forearm with a healed end and nothing else in the drawer that can be connected to it. Number 2. Shanidar 1. In the Zagros Mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, a wide cave mouth opens on a slope above the Greater Zab Valley. Shanidar Cave is enormous with a floor of deep, layered deposit that has been occupied on and off for tens of thousands of years, and it was still in seasonal use by herding families in the 20th century. It was tested in the late 1920s by the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod, who found animal bone and stone tools, but no human remains. Serious excavation began in 1951 under Ralph Selecki of Columbia University and continued across several seasons through the 1950s. The trench went down through meter after meter of occupation. 10 Neanderthal individuals came out of it in total. In 1957, the team recovered the one that has been argued over ever since. The individual is an adult male, Neanderthal, usually placed somewhere in the range of 50,000 to 45,000 years old, who died between the ages of 35 and 45. By the standards of his population, that is old. Most Neanderthals in the fossil record did not reach it. His right arm is the feature everyone returns to. The shoulder is withered, and the limb reduces to a weakened stump, reaching to just above the elbow. There is no forearm and no hand. In their 2017 study, Eric Trinkaus and Sebastian Villot set out the most likely sequence. An amputation above the elbow, possibly following a fracture that never united, and the muscle wasting that came with it. The arm is not the whole of it. He had taken a crushing blow to the left side of the face that fractured the eye socket with probable loss or reduction of vision on that side. He had trauma and arthritis in the right knee and foot, including a healed fracture in one of the bones of the forefoot, which together produced an abnormal gait. There is evidence of a degenerative condition affecting the spine and joints, and in both ear canals he had advanced bony growths with the right side bridged completely across the opening, which would have caused serious conductive hearing loss. Set out plainly, a man who was deaf or close to it, half-blind limping, and missing one arm below the shoulder in an environment shared with cave bears, leopards, and hyenas, in which the ability to hear something approaching is not a convenience. Every one of those injuries shows healing. Not one of them killed him. There is an argument going back decades about whether they arrived together or separately. One reading traces the arm, the eye, and the gait back to a single event: a heavy blow to the left side of the head that damaged the part of the brain controlling the right side of the body. Another reads them as an accumulation across a hard life. The skeleton supports both and cannot decide between them. The question of whether the arm was surgically removed has never been settled, and the honest position is that it probably cannot be. In 1988, Jan Litava, working through a differential diagnosis of the shoulder, ran a series of experiments cutting through limbs with stone tools. Severing the bone took him between 17 and 27 minutes, and he had to replace his blades 2 or 3 times as they dulled. That is the practical shape of the procedure. If a procedure occurred, not a stroke, but nearly half an hour of continuous work on a conscious person who has to be held still. The team that published the Borneo amputation in 2022 took the more cautious line, noting that the malformed forelimb of Shanidar 1 is as easily explained by progressive loss to disease or by accident. What that argument has never touched is the part that does not depend on it. However, the arm came off, and whoever did or did not remove it, the man was kept. He did not forage efficiently with one hand on that terrain. He could not hear a warning. Someone brought him into middle age over years with no expectation of return. This is where the evidence has to be handled carefully, because the temptation is to read compassion straight off a healed bone. A survey of injury and illness across the Neanderthal fossil record published in 2019 by Penny Spikins and colleagues made a point worth holding on to. The cases that survive to be found are the extreme ones, the costly ones. They are a poor sample of what ordinary care looked like. Recent foraging societies treat wounds, fevers, and fractures as a matter of routine with provisioning and support and plant medicine, and almost none of that leaves any trace at all. The healed catalog on Shanidar 1 is not the top of a scale. It is the one point on the scale that happens to be visible. Selecki found other individuals in the same cave, including the burial around which the long argument about Neanderthal flowers has been conducted. Shanidar 1 needs none of that. His skull and the surviving parts of his skeleton are in the Iraq Museum in Baghdad. The record they carry is a list of injuries, every one of them closed over by living bone on a man who could not have survived a single one of them alone. Number 1. The grave under the hand stencils. On the Sangkulirang Mangkalihat Peninsula in East Kalimantan, in the Indonesian part of Borneo, a limestone, karst landscape of cliffs and forest holds hundreds of caves. Many of them are painted. Some of the images on their walls are among the oldest figurative art known anywhere, and alongside the animals are hand stencils made the same way. They were made at Gargas, a palm against the rock pigment blown around it. One of these caves is called Liang Tebo. It is a large chamber system, and it can be reached only by boat and only at certain times of the year. In March 2020, a joint Indonesian and Australian team cut a test trench into the cave floor. Just under a meter down, they reached a grave. A cluster of limestone rocks laid over the head and arms, a visible boundary in, section between grave fill and the sediment beneath it, and inside a nearly complete human skeleton. The left foot was missing. So was the lower third of the left leg. The first question was whether the bones had simply been lost. They had not. The team searched the grave fill and the surrounding deposit and found nothing. The next season, the bioarchaeologist, Melandri Vlok, examined the ends of the left tibia and fibula and described what she saw as a clean, straight oblique termination with no crushing and no splintering, the shape a sharp blade produces when it is taken through bone at an angle. Both bones carried a callus. On the tibia, the new growth had spread toward the fibula, fusing the two stump ends into a single mass. The bones of the left leg were smaller and thinner than those of the right, which is what happens when a limb stops growing normally, and which suggested the leg had been lost in childhood. The individual was around 19 or 20 when they died. Whether they were male or female could not be determined. The dating came from 3 directions: radiocarbon on charcoal from the layers above, below, and within the grave, electron spin resonance and uranium series measurements taken directly from one of the molars. All of it converged on the same answer at least 31,000 years. The bone remodeling put the survival at 6 to 9 years. The leg was not the only thing that happened to this person. The second vertebra of the neck had been broken at some point during life and had healed out of alignment with the one below it. The right knee joint had begun to degenerate, which is what a knee does when it takes the load of a body that has been walking differently for years. Neither of those injuries killed them either. But here's where the significance of the find sits, and it is not in the number. Until 2022, the accepted model held that complex surgery emerged with settled agriculture because farming produced the injuries, the population density, and the accumulated knowledge to make it possible. The oldest case anyone accepted was the elderly man at the Buthiers Boulancourt at roughly 7,000 years. Liang Tebo predates him by around 24,000 years in a tropical rainforest among mobile foragers. The result was published in Nature on the 7th of September 2022 with Tim Maloney of Griffith University as lead author. 6 months later, the same journal ran a challenge. 4 orthopedic trauma surgeons argued that the skeleton is better explained by an injury they see regularly, an open fracture of the lower tibia and fibula involving the growth plate, of the kind common in adolescence, followed by the ordinary course of such an injury. They pointed out that cutting through the thick cortex of a tibia without metal tools would be extremely difficult, and that anyone with sharp instruments and an intention to remove a foot would sensibly go through the ankle joint instead, where there is no shaft to cut. They also argued that the changes at the bone ends are consistent with infection rather than its absence. The original team replied, in the same issue conceding an error in one figure and defending the diagnosis, which they had reached by elimination fracture. First, the natural causes of limb loss, and only then surgery. The dispute is unresolved, and it may stay that way. But the surgeons who disagreed wrote something in their own paper that is worth more than the argument they were making. Even if there was no operation, they said, this is a person who survived for years after a severe open injury in the Pleistocene, and to do that would have required enormous support from the people around them. That is the finding, and both sides hold it. Strip out the question of who cut what. What remains is a child in a rainforest 31,000 years ago who lost a leg below the knee. That child did not die of blood loss, did not die of infection in the weeks that followed, did not die of hunger or exposure in the years after that. Someone stopped the bleeding. Someone kept the wound clean without any concept of what infection was. Someone carried food and carried a body across broken limestone country for as long as it took, and then for 6 to 9 years more. The grave held one other thing, a lump of red ochre placed with the body. The cave is still there, in a landscape reachable by water for part of the year and closed for the rest of it. On the walls above the trench are the stenciled hands, palms pressed flat against limestone by people who lived and died in the same place. The trench has been backfilled. The bones are in a laboratory. What the burial recorded was never a technique, and the argument over the technique has always been beside the point. It recorded a decision made by a group of foragers with no medicine, no metal, and no writing that one of them was worth keeping. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.